Rob and I both have various roles across our people consulting business, where we focus on elements of digital transformation, employee experience, but as the poll alluded to, the criticality of human when it comes to landing agility in the workforce. So really great to see that focus on leadership and on upskilling, because we would very much like to bring some of the thoughts that we've been discussing with our clients around how the human element of driving agility has been so critical in the pandemic.
Fantastic. Morning to you as well, Rob, alongside Matt.
Thank you. When leadership came up at the top, I was thinking, well, what have we put in our thinking today? And to be fair, we certainly talk about leadership, but actually, I'd like to think what we're doing is talking about what our leaders need to know, or what our leaders need to be thinking. It's great to say we need leadership, but we're going to try to unpeel that a bit and say, what are those things that our leaders need to be aware of?
Perfect. Thanks so much. I'll kick us off. So if you want to just drive through to the next slide, I'll give a bit of a view on how we want to step through some of that kind of hypotheses that Robert and I just outlined. So firstly, I think there's a bit of taking a step back and reflecting on what we call this unanticipated experiment we find ourselves in. And we wanted to frame that as we see a series of internal and external forces which are driving organizations to focus on agility and resilience. And to Robert's point, we want to peel that back and what is really pushing and pulling on that and how organizations making sense of it. That then brings us through to this concept of, what does the future fit DNA of an organization look like when it is truly embracing agility and resilience? And how does that trickle down into the employee lifecycle, but also threads of leadership, business process, and other components I've been seeing folks already add into the chat this morning. Then as kind of HR lovers at heart, Robert and I will come quite clean. In the third arena, we did want to talk about the unique view we believe HR has, or the unique role HR has in driving organizational agility. As we know, the pandemic has been a human event. It has completely repositioned the role of HR and CHROs, but also talent leaders and leadership more broadly in organizations. And we wanted to dissect a bit further the role that HR can play in really driving this agility forward. And we'll kick off with a bit of that taking a step back. And for this, I wanted to frame it under two guises. If we look first at some of the internal drivers, and again, by no means are these new to many of you on this call. These are all components of what we would call the world of work that have been driving different threads, different pressures, different needs on organizations for quite some time. As you can see, they cut across components of employee experience, where there's been a change in expectations of employees, but there's also now this new strain on agility and resilience when it comes to how we're all working. The fact that we're having this session virtually, the fact that most people will be working in a hybrid type model post the pandemic, with the component of work physically face-to-face in collaboration with their colleagues, virtually, etc. But we've also seen through the pandemic forces and drivers really pushing for transparency within organizations. And that's why I wanted to include and call out purpose and trust. Again, not a new concept in the world of work, not a new requirement on organizations, but something we've seen a greater focus on as a result of the pandemic, really testing, why do people work within an organization? What do I expect to get out of that organization? And how do what I do contribute to the purpose of that organization? And then this all goes without saying, expectations has fundamentally changed. And the main thing we're seeing in the data coming back around this internal driver, which is quite good for accelerating the agility agenda, is choice. Individuals want greater choice in when they work, how they work, what they're doing, how they're rewarded, who they collaborate with. And that flexibility is both good from an organizational health perspective, but offering opportunities to think about how you reskill and upskill the workforce, which was a really interesting, I think, second thread that was coming through quite clearly from a polling perspective. But as these kind of threads or these forces have been around for quite a bit of time, what's different, so to speak, right now, or how are these really being accelerated as we navigate ourselves through the pandemic? So Robert, I don't know if you wanted to add a little color commentary from an external perspective on what external drivers we're seeing as well.
Yeah, and the first thing I'll point out in this little beehive of talking points is that on the left, you've got employee expectations, and on the right, you have customer expectations. And I mention that because I'll say this probably more than once, and Matt's sick of me saying it, but there's a concept of symmetry of attention. And that is, as things are changing on the right and we deal with them, there needs to be a symmetrical attention to the left. And all these external drivers have been going long before COVID-19 hit the planet. And I'll start with the bottom, since this is the Digital Leadership Forum. And I actually think the bottom, that digitization, I don't have to explain what that is to you folks, but it's profound. It's actually profound. And the innovations and the technology that's driving that and the capabilities that are emerging is actually one of the root causes of most of these other stuff. So it's a root cause for changing customer expectations. What our customers expect, and I'm sure Sky's going to be talking about this later, is changing. But it's also, sad to say, a root cause of some of the economic uncertainty, not all of it for sure, some of the regulatory changes that we see emerging. And I think I could go on and on about those too. But all three of those, the digitization, broadly speaking, the introduction of digital technologies in all sorts of fashion, the economic uncertainty that is part and parcel of disruption, of when our enterprises are disrupted, when our economies are disrupted, combined with trade disruptions and Brexit and political, combined with the regulatory changes that are hitting us because of the unintended consequences of big tech, social media, and other things, and all kinds of other protectionist trends and populist trends, that all of those things were going on before COVID-19, but COVID-19 accelerated all of those. It's just exacerbated, and in a bad way, but accelerated in a good way. The digitization and the customer expectations especially. And of course, the war for talent, I think we'll have a lot to say about that in the rest of the presentation. So I think that sets the stage. And I don't know if you want to put up, these are just some factoids, just from recent research that we've been doing, and also external research. So you have executives, in this case from GSA, who put digital transformation accelerating. And frankly, that's everything I see in all my engagements, not just those executives. We have 71%, this prediction coming out that we're going to go from 71% of tasks performed by humans to 58. So a rapid automation that we're seeing everywhere of activities. And what that's doing is it doesn't automate, as you all know, an entire human's role. It automates pieces of it, and that will have implications we'll talk about in a moment. And then seeing that the benefits of this are operational efficiency, faster time to market, and of course, meeting those customer expectations that I started with on the right. But I think rather than go on and on, because this is context setting and you're all probably familiar with it, but we thought it would be fun to share a quick video, very short, which we think encapsulates what we then need to do. So as Matt started, we think with all of this going on, the focus is going to have to be human-centered design, human-centered approaches and mindsets. And when we put leadership at the top, that's sort of the first thing that leaders have to sort of reconfigure the way they think, around the human. I think we've got a fun, quick exercise, hopefully for most of you. We're going to use Menti rather than the Zoom polling. You've got the QR code there. You've also got the Menti code, www.menti.com, if you don't use the QR code. And if you go into that real quick, what we're going to be asking you is, if you look at those hexagons, is we're going to ask you to pick the top two from your perspective that are affecting your business the most. So of all those hexagons, if you had to pick the two that were making the biggest impact on you. And Mikey, I don't know if you're checking responses there on the Menti application.
Indeed. Yeah, we've got a good range of responses. So we're currently looking at 16% for employee experience, 20% for agile workforce, 23% for employee expectations, 11% for purpose and trust, and then the one that's coming out top is virtual work at 30%.
Virtual work, and that's no surprise. And I thought, I was just checking to see if if it was hanging up there. It's no surprise given given what we're doing today. And frankly, Matt can tell you all I've been doing since March is working with enterprises to get their virtual work environments and capabilities and all the policies that surround that rapidly up to speed. Everything from how do we onboard employees virtually, how do we service their equipment virtually at home, to looking at benefit policies. Do we start provisioning the home office? Do we start making accommodations for them? For health and safety purposes back at home. We used to when we knew they were coming into a physical location, we could try to make sure the ergonomics were there. All sorts of things that have suddenly become, even if it was a portion of the workforce that used to be remote, it's become really critical. And likewise for our customers. Well, why don't we move on?
Perfect. I think we've got a second question actually, Robert, that should be up and running.
So I've just forwarded the Menti on for everyone who's on. We're looking at the external drivers now. I can see some people are voting in. So we're currently looking at top is economic uncertainty at 41%, digitization 25%, regulatory changes at 15%, customer experiences at 13%, and then war for talent at 3%.
Yeah, so I think the corollary, and chime in if you disagree, but the corollary to the pandemic that we're navigating for most enterprises and for most individuals is economic uncertainty for vast numbers of people and large parts of the business, of our business world. So that sort of makes sense.
Perfect. So I guess under that guise, if we want to move forward, Mikey, I think actually, Robert, you wanted to do a bit of framing first on how are these forces kind of coming together, and thematically, how are many of our clients thinking about how best to navigate them?
Well, it's interesting. We know virtual working was at the top, and this is really about that. I put the economic uncertainty to one side. This is about the virtual working, and really, there's these three aspects. So we see the laptop and the mobile phone there. It's just indicative of the fact that we can now work, and we want to work, and we are working literally from our bedrooms, from the trains, if we're allowed on them, from cafes. And when we move around, it needs to be seamless. The shift from working in the morning here in my home office to maybe getting on the tube, traveling to somewhere as I'm working, I want seamless connectivity, and ability to get my work done. There's working better, and there you see a bunch of people standing around, fancy graphs being generated. But what we're trying to convey is the importance of data now. So the way we're working, what makes it better, has to do not only with data, but it's better organized data that we've made meaningful, data that we've made easy to digest and comprehend, that's timely. Back to virtual working, this idea of, this old idea of a ONA, organizational network analysis, understanding who's doing what, where the clusters of work are. That was always interesting, but now it's more than interesting. Now it's becoming essential. And frankly, it's needed for the third thing. So there's lots of examples of working digitally, differently. Not digitally, differently. Digital enables it, but Matt and I like to just use Uberization of work. The idea is really that, think about deconstructing traditional job roles that sort of said, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, that guy over there does the other thing. And we're deconstructing the roles and making a gig-like atmosphere more and more, so that you have teams coming together to get something done and then reconfiguring on another activity, and the members of those teams are fluid, people being brought in to do just what we need from them, and then they go away. And all of that, if I put my HR hat on or my finance hat, it doesn't work with our traditional systems. Finance loves cost centers, doesn't it? And if my resource is bouncing around, who do I charge the cost to? And the guy who owns me is pissed because I'm not working on all the activities I'm working on. So I'm pointing out that working any or working better, it's easy to say those things, but there are real obstacles in our way. This is what people are already doing, quite frankly, but they're sometimes inhibited from the full ability to do it. So Matt, I'll turn it back to you with that framing.
Yep, no, thanks for that, Robert. So I guess with all of that kind of inertia, I would say almost pressing against agility and resilience, but with that force of disruption, kind of from a pandemic perspective, we're seeing that as an opportunity. And that's an opportunity for organizations to leapfrog when they think about how to drive agility within their organization and their wider ecosystem. Well, also this concept of resilience. And we keep talking about agility and resilience together, and particularly in balance. Because as Robert rightly called out, there's a level of balance in which organizations can actually absorb and drive agility forward, but there's also a level of slack required in the system that we found many organizations who went too hard on efficiency, lean management, driving process integration, actually going too far with degrees of digitization. There was pushback. Supply chain components of their organizations actually failed through the pandemic because they went too far when it came to driving a lean organization. So when I say resilience, I'm also talking about that component of how do you find the right balance of agility, but also putting that slack and capacity in your organizational system to balance the economic uncertainty, the change in the regulatory market, all of those things that Robert highlighted up front on the right side from an external driver's perspective that we all now realize are changing day to day, quarter to quarter. So in navigating this, there are kind of 9 building blocks that I wanted to highlight to the group. And again, please put in commentary and we'll have a polling question next on what resonates. So absorb a bit and then be ready to kind of give a point of view on what this means to you. But when I talk to clients and client organizations, and many of my clients are CHROs in the past, I've actually been working more with CIOs and COOs through the pandemic, as there's been a convergence around many of these people-related topics, or the people threads of agility and resilience coming onto the forefront of a CIO's agenda through digitization, or a COO's agenda through the health and the continuity of the workforce. So who owns that responsibility? Is it a COO from a continuity of operations perspective? Is it a CHRO, or is it a combination or divergence of responsibilities across the exec? And these kind of 9 themes are probably a synthesis of numerous conversations that Robert and I have been having across this different stakeholder landscape for the last 6 months. And I would say where most of the conversations start is around these 3 blocks. And these aren't new, but people are thinking about them differently. And I really think the lead out of the gate is probably demand and supply, but it's understanding changing demand through the lens of skills. As we all know, you could be running a business P&L, you could be in HR, you could be in finance. Workforce planning is horrific in most organizations. It's done bottom up, it's based on a budget. It's not led by skills and capabilities and what the organization needs to thrive, nor to serve the customer, to serve the employee. So we've really seen this change in dynamic of a move away from workforce planning, but to this focus around talent planning. How do I think about in the short term from a just in time where I need certain skills and capabilities across my supply chain to deliver? But in the medium term, how do I need to reskill? How do I need to bounce? How do I need to pivot capabilities and personas in my organization to be future fit? And there's this greater focus in thinking 1, 2, 3 years out around how these roles are going to be disrupted and how and what is required to actually create the right capacity with those right skills. To link it back to one of my internal drivers in the opening, there's also this conversation around purpose. I spent 2 hours last night with the CHRO of the NHS, 1.5 million employees, biggest employer in the world, 15,000 people in HR. And we were having a conversation around the role that HR plays in reskilling the NHS in this country and the role that has in broader society and driving equality in this country. And there was this sense of responsibility, and it was a quite inspirational conversation I was having, and one I'm having with many HR leaders across organizations, to say, there's a bigger purpose, there's a bigger responsibility and accountability on the organization to think about the skills and capabilities within, not only to serve the customer, to drive profit, but to contribute from a long-term value perspective back to society, back to customers, back to communities, etc. So I kind of frame that as our first three building blocks. If you go on to the next three, Mikey, and these really touch upon, I think, Clive, some of the components you highlighted in the opening poll. We then think about how do we start putting that into action? What are those fundamental components of the organization that we need to rewire to really scale agility? And I think of this middle layer as kind of the secret sauce from an agility and a resilience perspective, where we know organizations need to break down legacy components of ways of working. They need to reinvest in what digital leadership skills look like. You know, I've never had such at-length conversations with organizations around empathy as I have in the last 6 months. You know, to Robert's point around human-centered, what is the human-centered lens to leadership? How do you build cultural awareness and empathy and collaboration and a mindset of an outcome across your leadership organization, all through embracing digital, but also balancing equity? Because as Robert called out, digitization is not only driving divergence in society from a socioeconomic perspective, it's driving divergence in the workplace on who has access to opportunities. And for a digital leader to understand how to actually bring that equity and take the workforce forward with them, we've seen a massive push and focus around building this cohort of digital leaders going forward. And I think it goes without saying, you know, from an inclusivity perspective, and to my point around equity, it's around building that leader that can build and take that team forward, that diverse team, diverse thought, diverse mind, diverse idea, which again, we all know is critical from an agility and resilience perspective to building that muscle in the organization. The last three blocks I wanted to highlight, I think it was almost a bit of a hygiene factor. And foundational. I think one of the participants from AstraZeneca put a comment in the chat in the beginning around, you know, foundational process simplification, you know, thinking about Robert's point around seamless workplace experiences. If I'm going to work in 4 different physical environments in a day, I need to be able to seamlessly move from one to the other and be supported by the right digital enablement to do my job frictionless. And a lot of these underpinning components around how to deploy resources, how to support your organization through digital and enabling technology, and then how to just make things easy from a workplace and a collaboration perspective is obviously where many organizations have been focusing on for quite some time, but where we've seen a huge acceleration in focus on really how to integrate seamlessly but drive personalization. And again, I know we've all been talking about personalization from a customer perspective for quite some time, but that over-investment on how to differentiate that personalized experience is probably the new thread we've seen organizations really up the ante on when it comes to focusing on these last 3 fundamental blocks. So that kind of gives you a bit of a broad view around how we're finding organizations deconstruct their, you know, their pathway or their journey to agility and resilience, and particularly through the thread of human. How this comes together, I just wanted to show the group we have with us here today, you know, that commentary I made around this DNA of the future organization. And some of this language and some of these sentiments came out in the video that Robert shared earlier around those blocks could take your organization in very different ways. And how do you manage that divergence as you build agility? Because, you know, the tension of agility is divergence to a degree, because you're driving empowerment. You're allowing the organization to innovate and go in multiple different pathways at different ways. But again, that's why I bring back this thread of resilience, which is that counterbalance. And how we've been discussing this with many organizations and kind of bringing this back together in the concept of the DNA is these 9 blocks that I share need to balance out and come together to find the right blend of these 5 components for your organizational blueprint. Connected from both a customer perspective and an internal perspective in how organizations really collaborate. Many of my clients are media, many of my clients are creative, and I had a lot of concerns from my clients in the beginning of the pandemic. How are our creatives going to collaborate? How are we going to find ways to recreate the natural processes of innovation when we're doing it virtual? So there's this big focus on, as we're building agility into the organization, how do we ensure we drive connectivity at the same time? I think flatter goes without saying, is probably most have been on a journey on in regards to thinking about how to delayer and integrate, but really build in the right points of leadership, visibility, and collaboration. And in doing so, breaking down the hierarchical barriers that typically paralyze or drive noise and bureaucracy into the system, which detract people from ideation, from innovation, from collaboration, has been a clear focus on how do we use the pandemic to break through much of the hierarchical noise that many organizations have struggled with. Flexible, to Robert's points and the building block of supply and demand, it's great to know what you need and how those skills are going to evolve over 2 or 3 years. Reframe your way in which you're going to attract them. But if you don't have a scalable muscle to deploy them, to reward them, to manage their performance based on outcomes, you won't be able to sustain that agility within the organization. And I think this flexibility thread is one that we focus on with many organizations on how to actually take that concept of theory into practice, but then most often how to scale that in that regard. And then I think collaboration and team-based go together quite nicely. And those are obviously very much focused around how do we drive this move from individual to collective outcomes? How do we bring individuals into an environment where there is this, safety net, this psychological safety net? And it's one thread we've seen come up over and over again through the pandemic, that agility and resilience needs to individually benefit our people. And through teaming and collaboration, we need to reinforce this psychological safety net, that it is comfortable for individuals to put themselves into new environments and work in new ways, etc. And the organization will take care of them, and the organization will reward them and acknowledge them in the right way. So with all of that, I'll shut up for a moment and we'll go back to Menti. And I know quite a bit to process, and it's great to see some comments already coming through in the chat, which I'll take a read of in a moment. But we just wanted to ask one kind of initial reflection off the fly. If you were presented, with these tiles and you're thinking through them within your organization, which ones would you find most critical to kind of rebuilding that DNA of your organization going forward?
Can see some results coming in, which is good. And it's looking very close up at the top. We've currently got digital leadership skills and ways of working tied, 25%, closely followed by workforce resilience at 19%. Process optimization in 4th at 13%, and then we go to expand capability at 6%, along with demand and supply, and then workplace experiences and build teams at 3% each. I think, it's very much a close competition between ways of working and digital leadership skills.
So just reflecting on that, Robert, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to bring to life through your own work with clients navigating, these similar components, or if we wanted to continue the discussion forward.
Well, actually, I think if we go to the next slide, I can do 2 birds with 1 stone. Also conscious of trying to keep to time for all the other speakers coming up. And, the fact that we saw at the top, once again, digital leadership skills and ways of working. Let's look at these. This is sort of a summary before we switch gears here. So if I was to summarize the imperatives for the enterprise, and therefore, from our point of view, things that the HR function, we've got a little bit of that hat on, what the people function can do to help the enterprise. In terms of both these things, which are a lot around ways of working. So when we talk about agile organizations, and if I was to summarize everything we've just covered, there's a big component of it that we could talk about, which is operating horizontally across our enterprises, both on behalf of customers who don't want to have to navigate us or our systems or the information that we have, but also for our employees, same thing. So I think we all understand what horizontal is there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And of course, accelerating the digital, and we've went on endlessly about that. I know there's some interest out there about how technology applies to all of this, and indeed, there's a lot of technology that does two things. So working with, most recently, land registry. And I use them because they're really interesting, because you might think of land registry, as you should, as 100-year-old, very, set in its ways kind of government agency that has lots of, handwritten charts and records in file drawers. And that's actually quite true. All of that's quite true. And when the pandemic hit, we still had to do the work of the land registry around deeds and ownership and transfers of property, and everyone was at home. So they needed to accelerate digital. And what was interesting is they thought it was going to be a big problem, but it turned out everyone already had most of the tools and were using them, whether they were supposed to be or not. People had Teams, although it wasn't widely used. People had Zoom. You get the idea. And so people just started getting on with it, but in a very uncontrolled, unorganized fashion. And I don't want to go on and on about that in the digital. What you see here is sort of the unexpected aspects of digital that's listed here. We do have issues that come up in this way of working, of stress, of new working hours and working patterns, of home life balance. I think we all appreciate that, so I don't need to elucidate it. But the enterprise has to sort of sit back and say, what do we do about this? We can't just, if I'm supposed to be a manager, how do I manage in all of this? So that workforce vitality you see there. The horizontal has implications for, when we get back to that leadership point, leaders need to understand what this means for our organizational strategy if we're going horizontal. And the horizontal leaders of those the vertical leaders of the traditional vertical silos that we're asking to work together, it begins with them. It begins with them. We need new performance architecture to handle this new, when I referenced Uberization of work or gig, I wasn't implying the traditional meaning of those. Gig has an external supply of, maybe reaching some real limits there, but it was the concepts as they're used internally. So how do I begin to manage traditional performance and goal setting and feedback when people's activities become more chunked and bite-sized within the organization? The point is, those two top things which we understand actually enable and require the bottom two. So as we make the shifts on top, we're going to have to refocus and reprioritize spend. That might mean focusing on enabling technologies more because we have to. It might mean on skill development in certain areas more than we have, but we have to begin prioritizing. We just can't simply spend more. So when we're doing that, what can we afford to spend less on? And all of that is in the name of, just to remind you what Matt pointed out throughout all of this, that we're not only delivering financial value, which is still on the books, clearly, but we're delivering these other three things: human value, value to our consumers, and then again, our broader society.
Perfect. All right. Thanks so much, Robert. And apologies, Clive, for running over, but we'll leave you with those sentiments. So I think our main thread of kind of human and not underappreciating the people and talent component of driving workforce or organizational agility and resilience is really what we wanted to share with you today.
Yeah, so I think we can summarize there.
And hope that was useful.